Hi, I'm Sarah. We are once again in the small chapel at Northern Seminary. Welcome to the show. And did you know that in all probability, the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat? Ziggurats were large, pyramid-like structures that were used in ancient Sumerian worship and were a key part of the temple complex within a city. In fact, back then, people didn't live in cities, so a city pretty much was just a temple complex. Archaeologists have found around 30 ziggurats in this general area and have discovered texts that mention several more. And that's just one of the things about the book of Genesis that I bet you didn't know. Ziggurats were dedicated to specific gods, and in the case of the Tower of Babel, it's obvious that people wanted to dedicate this ziggurat to the Lord, or Yahweh, the God of the Bible. The purpose of a ziggurat is to support a stairway, which would make it convenient for the god to come down from the heavenly realms to the earthly realm. At the top there would be a room set with a bed and a table for the god, and at the bottom was the temple building itself, where the god could receive gifts and worship from his followers. And here's the crime of the Tower of Babel. They portrayed and acted as if God had needs that humans could meet. The idea in this culture is that the god had important work to do, keeping the chaos monsters at bay, making sure the sun rose every morning, and providing rain so crops could grow. And humans benefit from all this, so they really want the god to keep doing his job. So, to keep the god happy, they provide for all his needs, providing him food and a place to rest. But our God has no needs. He provides for us, not the other way around. Knowledge of who God is and what God is like has been twisted and distorted by their sin. They still want God's presence, which we lost when we lost the Garden of Eden, but they are treating God as if he has needs, which might be one of the most insulting distortions of God that exists. This is why God is displeased and why he confuses their language. In the very next chapter of Genesis, chapter 12, God begins to reveal himself to Abram, who would become Abraham, the first of the patriarchs. God begins to teach Abram, and therefore teach us, about himself, because that knowledge has obviously been lost to sin. The ultimate salvation of Jesus on the cross only makes sense if we understand how God works and what he is like. In the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5, the seventh name on the list is Enoch. In verse 24, we're told that Enoch walked faithfully with God, and then he was no more, for God took him away. This makes Enoch one of only two people in the Bible we're told don't die. The other is the prophet Elijah, who was taken into heaven by a chariot of fire. You know, the chariot of fire sounds a little scary, but I really like the not dying part. Before God took him, Enoch had a son named Methuselah. The Bible tells us that Methuselah lived to 969 years old. That makes him the oldest person to have ever lived. That we know of. I know what you're thinking. 969 years? That seems outlandish. And the other names in Genesis 5 have lifespans almost as crazy. Can we really expect these numbers to actually be real? But the Bible doesn't have anything on the Mesopotamian kings. The kings that reigned before the flood are reported to have lived much, much longer. The shortest of one of these kings' reigns is 18,600 years. The shortest! Here's the deal. The Sumerian number system is a combination between base 6 and base 10. We use a base 10 number system. The same symbol is used to represent 36,000 in base 6 as it is to represent 1,000 in base 10. If these numbers are translated from base 6 to base 10, we end up with numbers very similar to the biblical ones, and the totals of the lists are almost identical. So while these numbers are still really big, all the evidence and data that we have suggests that they're accurate. It seems that before the flood, people just lived longer. Genesis 12 is the beginning of the Abraham account. God calls Abraham and tells him to move to the land of Canaan. In the space of only 6 verses, Abraham builds 2 altars, one at Shechem and one at Bethel. Building these altars was a way for Abraham to claim that land for God, and he built altars everywhere he went. In Genesis 15, Abraham, on God's instructions, takes a heifer, a female goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon, cuts them in half, and arranges them so that there's a path down the middle. Except he didn't cut the birds in half. Those he just killed and laid on either side. Abraham keeps all the scavenger birds and the birds of prey away from the cut-up animals. And then, that night, God appears to him as a torch and a smoking pot. The torch and the smoking pot travel down the path created between the cut-up animals, and while it's doing so, God repeats his promise to Abraham that his descendants will inherit the land of Canaan. The whole cutting animals in half ceremony obviously meant something to Abraham, but we're not quite sure exactly what it meant. It seems similar to a Hittite purification rite, but not similar enough to be of any real help to us. It could be some sort of oath or vow, something like, if I don't keep my end of this bargain, may I be as one of these animals, as in dead. That fits the context of the covenant, but doesn't make sense as something God would actually say. Bottom line, we don't know what this is about, but we do know that it reassured Abraham that God would keep his end of the covenant. And speaking of the covenant, Abraham waited 25 years to see any movement in it. He waited 25 years for Isaac to be born. God calls Abraham in chapter 12. That's when he leaves Haran, and he's 75 years old then. Isaac isn't born until chapter 21, when Abraham is 100 years old. That's 25 years of trusting and believing in God without having anything to show for it. It's really cool that Abraham had a kid at 100 years old, but can you imagine being 100 years old and going to PTA meetings and baseball games? Or football games? Maybe Isaac liked chess. Some of the nations that surrounded the later kingdom of Israel were Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Genesis records the origin of these nations. Edom was the descendants of Esau, who was one of Isaac's sons and the brother of Jacob. Moab and Ammon were the descendants of Lot and Lot's daughters, who were named Moab and Ben-Ami. Jacob was one of Isaac's sons and Abraham's grandson. He worked for his uncle Laban for a while, and after paying off some debts, they decided that his wages would be any streaked or spotted goat or dark-colored lamb that was born to Laban's flocks, which Jacob took care of. But Laban cheated and separated out all the streaked and spotted and dark-colored animals from the flock, and sent that flock 3 days' journey from Jacob. So Jacob was left with a flock without any streaked or spotted or dark-colored animals, and therefore a flock that was much less likely to produce streaked or spotted or dark-colored animals, which would greatly decrease his wages. But Jacob was undeterred. Back then, they didn't know a lot about genetics and stuff, so he uses the only knowledge he has. It was believed that the conditions at the time the parents mated, such as what they were looking at, would affect the offspring. So, since Jacob wanted streaked and spotted offspring to be born, he made sure the animals were looking at stripes when they mated. He did this by setting up branches within their line of sight. We're also told that he only did this for the strong animals of the flock, and not the weak ones. That way, the streaked or spotted animals that were born would also be the strongest. With what we know now, we know there's no reason such a plan would work, but it works for Jacob because of the Lord's blessing. It's God who increases Jacob's wealth, whatever Jacob might have been doing. The forbidden fruit that Adam and Eve eat and get kicked out of the Garden of Eden for was not an apple. Or rather, we don't know if it was an apple or not. But probably not, because apples grow in North America. The Bible only ever identifies it as fruit. And finally, I bet you didn't know that Adam and Eve's third son was named Seth, which means granted. In chapter 4, verse 25, we're told that Eve gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. Thanks for watching. Hope you had some fun. Maybe you learned some things. If you have a suggestion for a future show or something you just want to know, leave it in the comments and I'll get to as many as I can. So until next time, may free Wi-Fi always find you. Bye.